I want to introduce someone who's fighting every day to protect Native voting rights. Ms. Jacqueline De León is Isleta Pueblo and is a staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund. We're honored to virtually welcome Ms. De León to our event, and thank you for taking part.
Thank you, and thank you, Rebecca, for that absolutely wonderful, comprehensive presentation. I really enjoyed it. I love seeing those strong Native women being highlighted, and thought it was a really wonderful overview. And I want to thank you all for having me here today. I'm eager to talk to you all and talk a little bit about the contemporary barriers that face Native Americans, because I think that the contemporary barriers are really going to be surprising to many people, given how severe they are. Next slide. Like Rebecca mentioned, I'm a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the findings of my report, Obstacles at Every Turn. And what that report was a culmination of work that was completed, a series of 9 field hearings held around the country that was a product of the Native American Voting Rights Coalition. Next slide. What the Native American Voting Rights Coalition is a group of organizations, like Rebecca highlighted, local organizations like 4 Directions that work on Get Out the Vote, national organizations like NARF and NCAI, ACLU, other kind of organizations that are all sort of got together and asked the question, why is it that natives are voting at such low rates, and what can we do about it? Next slide. So what we did is we had a series of 9 field hearings across the country. I co-led them with another presenter, Jim Tucker. And what we did was we asked everybody that we could get our hands on, so community leaders, organizations, tribal leaders, community members, politicians, historians, really just anybody that had something to say about why it is that Native Americans vote at such low rates. And in part, some of this was in response to a Supreme Court case, Shelby County v. Holder, where the Supreme Court said that, this type of discrimination doesn't really occur anymore. We don't really need to worry about, overt acts of racism or discrimination anymore. That's all in the past, right? And what we did was go about to see, is it really in the past? Let's investigate. Next slide. So, the reason that we had these field hearings was in order to, try and get some answers so that we could enter into a public education campaign. We also wanted to develop public policy, and we also wanted, if need be, pursue legal remedies. And I'm happy to say that I've been very busy since the report came out. We have brought cases in Montana, South Dakota, Nevada, and sent a whole bunch of other letters telling people to clean up their act. Next slide. So like I said, this was a series of field hearings across the country. And so, one field hearing, we brought in people from multiple states and different tribes in order to get the most comprehensive picture we can. Next slide. And what we found was a remarkably consistent picture, which is really surprising, right? We've got so many different regions, so many different people, and yet we saw that time and time again, there were some factors that kept coming up that made it so that it was more difficult for Native Americans to vote. So high poverty rates, isolating conditions, I'll get into what those are, lack of resources and funding, residential features, non-traditional mailing addresses, voter ID, felony disenfranchisement law, threshold requirements for polling locations, a distrust of federal and state governments, and overt racism. Next slide. So like I said, like I mentioned, poverty makes it hard to vote, right? And I think that I start with this slide because I think that it speaks to when you vote, right, there are costs. And for a lot of people, those costs are really, really low, right? It's you just walk out your door and you can get your ballot in your mailbox, fill it in, and just pop it in your mailbox right outside. You get whisked away to your polling location and you voted. Other people, it's let me walk down to the corner, let me make a short trip somewhere that I'm really used to being, on my, while I'm running other errands, let me pop in to vote, right? In Indian country, those costs are not low. They are much, much higher. And you'll see that throughout the slides and throughout my presentation, is you'll think to yourself, that's an additional cost that somebody has to spend in order to cast their vote. And that's a problem because the higher the costs, right, the less likely you are to vote. And that's compounded and exacerbated by the fact that there's a really high poverty rate in Indian country, right? So the poverty rate is 26.6% nationally, and on reservation lands, it's as high as 38.3%. Next slide. So some of the isolating conditions that we see are, for example, geographic isolation, right? So we know, I think we all intuitively know that Native Americans can live in very rural areas. And if we're from reservation communities, we know what it is to be far, right? But, some of the empirical hard data, so is that Native Americans are often found in hard to count census tracts, which just means that the government recognizes that these are very rural areas. Next slide. There are also physical barriers present on Native American lands that make it difficult to traverse, right? So a lot of times they're underdeveloped. There's a lot of mountains, waters, canyons. In Alaska, for example, in order to vote, you've got to cross a river that may not be frozen in November. In Nevada, to reach an in-person polling place, you've got to drive around a mountain that can take up to 5 hours. So there are physical conditions that make it more difficult. There are also, I think, anybody that's been on a reservation knows that there are poor road conditions often, right? They can be muddy, they can be difficult to traverse, and we have to keep in mind that national elections are on November 3rd. The weather can be dicey, the roads can be bad. Next slide. So this is just an egregious example of the type of distances I'm talking about, which I think, frankly, can be shocking. Right? So the Duckwater has no in-person polling place. They only have vote by mail, and I'll get to why that's a problem in a little bit. But the closest in-person polling location is 360 miles round trip, right? That's 180 miles. And to get to Tonopah, it's 300 miles round trip. That is hours and hours and hours in a car. It has to be a working vehicle that has gas. Next slide. Additionally, so I don't think, right, that that's hard to conceptualize why it is that that's difficult to do, right? But there are also times where the examples are less extreme, but no less limiting, right? So in South Dakota, for example, the polling location for the Crow Creek Reservation was established off the reservation in a non-Native community with just 12 voters. And yet they refused to establish the polling location in Fort Thompson that had over 1,200 people, right? So the 1,200 people were forced to travel the 40 miles to go to the town with 12 voters. There's not a good explanation for this, right? Except for the prejudice of the individual county auditor. Next slide. Another isolating condition, which I think Rebecca alluded to, is the linguistic isolation. So there are, and especially among the elderly populations, Native voters that are that only speak their language. And so language assistance is required by law for several areas in Indian country where they have found that there's a significant Native population that requires language assistance. All too often we find jurisdictions out of compliance with this language assistance. Next slide. Technological isolation also plays a part. Over 90% of Indian lands don't have access to broadband. And for many of us that travel to a reservation, I'm used to my phone just completely, losing service the second I cross that reservation barrier. The deeper in I go, the less likely it is that I'm going to have phone service, not to mention internet service. Many people don't have the devices either. Next slide. So what that means, I think, if you look at the red areas, these are the least connected areas. And really, for people that know Indian country, it's going to be no surprise that these areas overlap quite a bit with Native American reservations. So this map, even though it's a map of technological isolation, looks like the map for Native American communities. And what that means is that when states tout things like online registration, right, that's not going to necessarily be effective for Native American communities. Sometimes there's talk about moving to online voting. That's not going to be an option in Native American communities. And sometimes even the type of equipment that states are switching to don't work without internet access, aren't going to work on Native American lands. Next slide. Additionally, we saw time and time again, there was a lack of resources and funding being appropriated to Native American communities. And the reason that we saw this was because county and local governments were denying the resources. Sometimes they just don't understand their role, right? Native Americans, tribes have sovereignty. We have our own governments. We work a lot we have lots of areas where we are sovereign and we are the controlling authority. Sometimes that can lead to counties being unsure of what their role is towards Native Americans. We saw time and time again, people say things like, they have their system, we have our system, let them stick with their system. Of course, Native Americans are American citizens. Native Americans are also entitled to the political power that comes with being American citizens and being able to vote. They're also county citizens, and counties are responsible for providing them full, fair, and equal access. Next slide. So we saw also time and time again that there was a lack of state and federal dollars being spent on Native American lands. So the registration opportunities just weren't reaching Native Americans. I live in Denver. I can't go out my front door, especially these days, even though I hardly go out my front door, but I can't go without somebody trying to sign us up for voter registration. NARF did a study in 2016 polling people and found that Native Americans throughout Indian country simply had never seen a voter registration drive. They simply did not, nobody had ever knocked on their doors. So political parties aren't spending money, neither Democrats nor Republicans are spending money to try and register Native Americans like we see in other areas. Next slide. So another big category of barriers that we saw time and time again are what we call residential features. So it's not surprising to anybody in Indian country that there's just a lack of housing, right? There's huge housing shortages. There were just 230 reservation homes in the Northern Arapaho tribe for 11,000 members, there's 11,000 members, but there's 230 reservation homes. That averages nearly 48 people per home, right? That's an untenable situation. More commonly, what we saw was 10 to 15 people that were living in a home throughout Indian country. People are often moving from home to home because they don't want to be so much of a burden on a single house. And what that means is that the people that are moving from home to home aren't going to have the type of paperwork that comes when you own a home, right? So the electric bills, the type of, things that say your address just aren't there. The driver's licenses that they may or may not get aren't going to have an address on it. Often tribal IDs do not have addresses on them for this reason. And so that means for states that require, for registration, you to bring in some proof of your address, that becomes a huge problem. And increasingly we have found and argued that that is not legal. For example, in North Dakota, NARF brought suit challenging their voter ID law that required a physical address. But the reason that was also so compelling, next slide, is because time and time again, reservation homes don't have a traditional mailing address on them, meaning that you live 2 miles north of a Hogan, and that's the way that you describe your address to people. It doesn't have the address 1234 Main Street on it, and that means you're not getting mail delivery, and you don't have an address that can readily be filled out on a registration form. The law requires that you're allowed to fill out like a little map, and you can say, I live here, this is the nearest marked cross street, and I live 3 miles northeast of that, in order to register. It's required. But we see there's difficulties doing that. There's difficulties doing that online, and it leads to difficulties in registration, and it makes it harder to vote by mail, which I'll get into in a second. Next slide. So again, it's the same thing. Next slide. So getting into vote by mail, right? I think vote by mail is kind of a darling among a lot of people, a lot of progressives that say, you know what? Voter turnout increases when you move to vote by mail. Let's move to vote by mail. Next slide. But there are a whole host of problems with vote by mail in Indian country, right? So like I said, if you don't have a consistent address, or if your home doesn't have an address on it and you're not receiving mail delivery, then that's going to be a huge problem for vote by mail, right? You're not going to have that option of safely going to your front door, filling out your ballot, and dropping off. Instead, you're going to have to travel to a distant post office. Next slide. That post office is often going to have, it's often going to be far, right? So it'll be in like the neighboring city, be 20 to 40 miles away. It's going to be a rural post office. So it's only going to be open, for example, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 to 3. And you're going to be sharing a PO box among a lot of family members. 10 to 15 family members are often, the same family members that are sharing a home are often sharing a PO box. And that means that people are picking up and dropping off mail for each other. It means that it is difficult to regularly access your mail. People go months, frankly, without picking up or interacting with their mail, could conceivably miss an entire election cycle. So these kind of distances and these kind of barriers make it difficult to vote by mail. And I'll just say a quick word. There has been a lot of discussion about ballot harvesting, and what that is actually is just ballot collection. And what that is in Indian country is people picking up and dropping off mail for each other because the post office is 40 miles away. And that's absolutely essential in Native American communities. It is absolutely essential that Native Americans be able to pick up and drop off mail for each other because they do not get at-home mail delivery service. So this isn't about some big conspiracy or fraud. It's about the practical ways that Native Americans overcome the unjust barriers in their lives. So ballot collection is really necessary. The next thing, which is what this slide is about, is that because, once again, Native Americans don't have that regular address, they're more often than not getting cut off from their voter rolls. People are reviewing their registrations, and then they're saying things like, this address doesn't make sense to me, and they just toss the registration. So somebody who thinks that they've registered and have registered to the best of their ability often show up to cast their ballot and are told that they can't, that they're not registered. Next slide. Voter ID laws, for some of the reasons that I've already kind of quickly talked about, are really problematic in Indian country because Native Americans don't have regular access to driver's license sites. In Montana, the Crow tribe has to travel, people have to travel 50 miles to the nearest in Standing Rock in North Dakota. They have to travel 50 miles to the nearest driver's license site. These kind of distances just make it really difficult to obtain a driver's license. And it also is just not a part of people's everyday lives, right? And so we saw a lot of times that driver's licenses were not being accepted. Next slide, excuse me, were being required, but Native Americans didn't have. have it. And so there's been a push to allow for Native tribal IDs. Now, tribal IDs only go so far. If the state has requirements on what has to be on those tribal IDs, so not just using the ID to identify who the person is, but also trying to use the tribal ID to verify other things like a person's address, it becomes really problematic because, like we said, Native Americans don't have physical addresses. And so this is one of the suits that NARF brought in North Dakota to talk about, or that challenged the voter ID requirement there that required a physical residential address. And I'll say that case was an example of somebody exploiting the structural inequities that exist in Native America today. And so what happened there is that in 2012, Heidi Heitkamp had won election. And that she was a Democrat. It was a surprise to the largely Republican state. She had a particularly weak opponent that year, and the Native American vote, it turned out, pushed her over the edge. In 2013, as a backlash measure, the legislature enacted a voter ID law. They said they accepted tribal IDs, but then required a physical address on them. In 2011, the legislature had been told that Native Americans don't have physical addresses, so they were well aware of what was going to happen. In 2014, we saw Native Americans getting turned away in large numbers, and that's when NARF heard about this because people contacted and said, I keep getting turned away trying to vote. And we litigated that case for 4 years, researched it for 6. And last year finally reached a settlement with the state after the issue gained national attention. Next slide. Another thing that keeps Native Americans from voting are felony disenfranchisement laws. The felony disenfranchisement laws are common, and they end up, they vary from state to state. I think there was a lot of news in this about Florida, for example. Florida recently overturned its felony disenfranchisement law, but then the legislature tried to impose additional requirements, for example, requiring that they pay off all of their fees before they'd be allowed to vote. But in those cases, I think it's particularly unfair because the state itself acknowledges that it does not know how much each individual ex-felon owes, and so they are unable to tell individuals how much they have to pay in order to vote. But because Native Americans, like African Americans and Latino Americans, are arrested at higher rates, they also they make up a disproportionate amount of the felon population. Additionally, because of unique jurisdictional issues in Indian country where state laws do not apply on the reservations because Native Americans are sovereign, unfortunately, the federal government instead has a Major Crimes Act that says that major crimes are the jurisdiction of the federal government on Indian lands, and as a consequence, because they have they end up overcharging a lot of times Native Americans on Native lands, so that the federal government is able to retain jurisdiction, and so Native Americans end up with higher incarceration and higher crime records, which ends up disenfranchising them down the line. Next slide. Another thing that we saw consistently disenfranchise Native Americans is these things called threshold requirements, which is a requirement that there be a certain number of people either living or registered in an area before they're given a polling place. And it's kind of the cart before the horse here that hurts Native Americans a lot. So states pass what seems like a neutral law, and they say, you know what, you need to have at least 500 people or 200 people registered to vote before we give a polling place. But because there has never been a polling place, right, there are not 200 people registered. Because of all these distance issues and all these barriers I've been talking about, people are not participating in the system. And so it's really difficult to get to that initial 200 registered people mark because there hasn't been the investment of a polling place or a voting center. Next slide. And so, you know, these are just a few examples. Next slide. Finally, you know, there's also these redistricting issues, right? So it's about cracking and packing people. And so let me discuss those terms really quickly. So sometimes in order to disenfranchise and disempower Native American communities that would otherwise you know, be really strong, state legislatures will try and put, for example, on a 3-seat county commission, they'll make, if there's an especially large Native population, they'll make one seat on that 3-person seat all Native and pack all of the Native Americans into one district. So they have one strong seat, but then 2 of the seats are controlled by the non-Native population. And that's something we saw, for example, in San Juan County, Utah. And there, the Navajo challenged being packed into a district when they made up 51% of the county. They were consistently only getting 1 seat. And so as a consequence, the court ordered San Juan County to draw new maps. The county refused. And so the court drew maps for them. In the most recent election cycle, San Juan County ended up electing 2 Native Americans to the county commission. Next slide. So what do all of these barriers mean, right? Why do all of these barriers suppress turnout? Well, it's not just that it makes it hard, right? Those costs that I was talking about earlier. Those costs that I was talking about earlier certainly make it hard and are reasons why people don't vote. But it also, I think, creates a culture of distrust. It communicates very clearly that Native Americans are not welcome and that this is not their system. And take on top of that all of the history that Rebecca was talking about, right? And it's no surprise that Native Americans highly distrust federal and state governments, right? And the other part about this is that, you know, as Rebecca had mentioned in her slide, does anybody know about why in the 1960s, New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona all were continuing to disenfranchise Native Americans? What that was is a reference to 3 cases that were brought at the time, challenging the fact that it was the official position of New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona that Native Americans were incompetent to vote, right? Because in previous court cases, the judge had likened the tribal relationship to like a ward to its guardian. And so the states then argued that Native people were not civilized enough to vote, right? It's a deeply insulting, deeply racist view that permeated and continues to have its legacy, because 1960 was not that long ago. And it wasn't until then that the courts finally overturned it. And those cases arose in the mid 50s is when they ended up being litigated. But the states finally allowed tribes to vote, but then immediately imposed literacy tests in order to limit Native Americans from being able to vote, akin to the Jim Crow laws that we saw. And I will say that the brave Native Americans that brought that suit were World War II veterans that had fought for the country and came back home and could not vote, and said, why not? And they said, because you're incompetent to vote. And they said, if I can fight for my country, then I can vote in my country. And the courts finally agreed. Utah pulled its law before final determination was made, probably seeing the writing on the wall. And full enfranchisement did not come until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, when things like the literacy tests were thrown out. But you know, voter suppression continued. Next slide. And so what we're seeing, like I said, was just an absolute distrust and exclusion of Native Americans from the American political system, both literally in the lack of location of polling locations, and figuratively and emotionally through the ways in which all of these barriers communicate to Native Americans that they are unwelcome. Next slide. And I would be remiss if I didn't actually talk about the overt racism that occurs in Native Indian country. So in South Dakota, the polling location was a repurposed chicken coop. In Arizona, the border town was so racist that they, to this day, block the water that goes into the neighboring reservation because, there's such deep animosity. There was consistent testimony that police were used to intimidate voters. Next slide. So for example, this was in 2019 or 2018. And this person was in North Dakota talking about how there's a heavier than usual police presence on the road between the reservation and the polling, where the polling place was, specifically on election day when they're not usually there, just checking the plates of people that go by. Next slide. And so these absolutely dismal facts, right? This absolute injustice that's occurring means that my job in a lot of ways is horrifically easy, right? It is throughout courts, it doesn't matter if a Republican or a Democrat appointed the judge. Courts are finding time and time again that there's been a violation of Native Americans' rights because the facts that we present are absolutely overwhelming. The injustice is so clear. And so we face a lot of hurdles. We are fighting, as Rebecca said, to increase turnout, to educate people about their rights, about what they're entitled to, that they're entitled to an on-person, on-reservation polling place, even in the time of pandemic. There's been this push to move by mail, but because of all the reasons I talked about, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to vote by mail in Indian country. And so in-person polling locations that have PPE, that offer things like curbside voting, are the safest way for Native Americans to vote. Next slide. And that's all I've got. So happy to answer any questions. I think there was like a couple of minutes of questions was on the agenda. So if anybody has any, let me know. If not, I'm happy to turn it over to the next speaker.
So we do have time. If you would like to ask any questions, you can put it into the Q&A box or you can use the chat function. We are getting people saying, thank you so much. This is fantastic information. Someone also says, sign up to be a poll worker. The average age of a poll worker is 70.
That's right, yeah. Please do, and please insist on, the proper PPE, face shields, allowing for curbside voting, social distancing. There are ways, we know increasingly that this is a respiratory illness. We know that there has to be circulating air, wearing masks is really and keeping distance and being outside to the extent possible in November. You can form queues with your cars where people are, given a number and they wait in their car and get called in individually. There are ways to do this safely. And we should all demand that of our of county officials. Also inquire in your reservation community if that on-person polling location is being maintained, because we see a lot of counties trying to move to all vote by mail, despite the fact that Native Americans just aren't going to receive that ballot. We have lots of reports of these ballots being just stacked up in post offices, or because the people are unable to get to the post office to pick them up, not because they're not wanted or not because they're not important. Kind of we hear these myths about, oh, all these abandoned ballots. No, it's because it's literally very difficult to get a ballot by mail in Indian country. So we think that it's really important that in-person voting locations are maintained and done safely. So please inquire with your county as to whether or not your in-person polling location that you're used to is going to be maintained, because it should be.
Now we do have two questions. The first one is, what's the best way to encourage those who feel their vote won't count due to past barriers they've witnessed? And then the second one is, what are resources to help those with disabilities as an additional barrier?
So first, I want to say that recognizing that somebody who doesn't vote because of past barriers and anger toward the system has a legitimate grievance, right? They're not crazy or lazy or uninterested in their communities. They're just taught over and over again that the system isn't for them, so why would they embrace and engage it, right? It's a legitimate feeling. But I think it's important to say and recognize that that is a tool of oppression. Like those states, I was saying, the reason that they said that Native Americans were incompetent is not because they felt that Native Americans were incompetent. They met Native Americans. They know that we are smart, intelligent, and capable people. It's because they were afraid of the political power that Native Americans could potentially yield. And Native Americans across this country can yield significant political power. We have within the margins that these elections are decided in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Arizona, North Nevada, all of these states, right? If Native Americans voted en masse, we could decide the presidential election. We could decide county elections. We should hold way more school board seats, way more seats in the House of Representatives. We would have much more much more power, and Native American sovereignty would be much better protected. And so the answer is, I understand your grievance, I understand your anger, but there's power out there, let's go get it. And what was the second question?
What are resources to help those with disabilities as an additional barrier?
Absolutely. So, disability is a huge issue. And another reason that we think in-person polling locations should be an option. So language assistance and disability assistance can often only be provided in person. And so we think that there should be in-person polling locations that are accessible, so not 100 miles away, for people so that they can go and get the help that they need to cast their ballot. And so that's all I have. I want to thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. Feel free, if you have any additional questions, to reach out to vote@narf.org.